Thanks to unprecedented proactive partnerships between our federal land management agencies, 11 western states, which you represent in part today, sportsmen, ranchers, farmers, and conservationists, the greater sage grouse does not need protections under the Endangered Species Act. This very significant achievement was possible thanks to years of on-the-ground collaborations and federal land management plans that conserve sagebrush habitat while simultaneously providing predictability for economic development, something we all care about. The federal land management plans are based on plans developed by each state, not one size fits all, but individual plans to suit each state's individual needs. And it was these very partnerships that made it possible for the Fish and Wildlife Service to conclude in 2015 that the greater sage grouse doesn't need to be listed as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act. The Trump administration's effort to overturn the federal land management plans, I believe, is putting all of these efforts at risk, creating uncertainty for those working on the ground to conserve this iconic species and its habitat, and increasing the likelihood that the species will need to be listed under the Endangered Species Act, something we all want to avoid. Mr. Tubbs, thank you for being here. You mentioned in your written testimony that Montana has a motto of think habitat. Why is focusing on habitat the best way to approach conservation of the sage grouse?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Congressman. What we do know about sage grouse, especially in Montana, since that's where I come from, is if you do have quality habitat, the birds will survive. The populations will go up and down over years. The trend had been down. We're improving most recently. But if you have good quality habitat, you can assure that the population will remain and grow into the future. The biggest threat in Montana, as opposed to the prior testimony, is fragmentation of that habitat, not fire for Montana.
So then what would your thoughts be on some of the sort of proposed alternatives to habitat-focused conservation, such as setting specific population targets or running a sage grouse captive breeding program? What are your thoughts about those possible alternatives?
Mr. Chairman, Congresswoman, while we certainly track population of sage grouse and also do lek counts every year, the populations vary year to year. One wet spring snowfall at the wrong time and your brood will die, and we'll lose all the population of that year, or a lot of it. And then it'll take several years to rebound. So any one given year is concerning to us because we might fall into ESA restrictions because of a bad spring. Instead, we think that quality habitat is a better measure. As far as, excuse me, the second part of the question.
The second part was captive breeding programs. Captive
breeding, and you can read all the literature that is not a useful tool in sage grouse conservation, has not been successful, and is limited to remnant populations. I do know Alberta is trying it, but again, it's a very small, marginal tool.
So one of the things I've become aware of in Montana, you have the significant challenge of having 78% of the state sage grouse habitat spread across state, tribal, and private lands. But despite that, you've been able to create the all lands, all hands approach, as you call it, bringing all these diverse stakeholders to the table. What keeps these partnerships together at a time when the Trump administration is seeking to upend the existing plans? What holds you all together?
Mr. Chairman, Congressman, we have actively kept the coalition together. Our plan is not a static plan. We're implementing it now with those stakeholders, and we have an Audubon to land trust to oil and gas industry and coal industry at the table. We have a common motivation to conserve the bird, make sure that Montana has an economy, and with those two goals, we are working together quite well. Ultimately, maybe plan amendments will be needed, but right now, let's do implementation.
Well, thank you for your testimony. It sounds to me like the existing framework established by the states focused on habitat protection and restoration is certainly working on Montana and the best chance we have of protecting the species from extinction or being listed under the Endangered Species Act. Thank you.
Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank our panel